We're full here. Move to the back. The lanky guy named Darren chewed his gum, his tone sharp, eyes flicking over Marcus Hayes like he didn't belong. Cole, the other guard, short and muscular, jutted his chin. This section's for graduating students' families only. Marcus, in his crisp Marine uniform, calmly pulled a ticket from his pocket, his voice low. This is my seat. I'm Jaden Hayes' father. But Darren didn't even glance at it. He smirked, speaking louder, like he wanted the whole auditorium to hear. Listen, don't make this hard. Go to the back, or we'll have a problem. As the two guards pressed a black former Marine to leave his son's graduation, no one expected for veterans to stand up, silencing the room without a word. Marcus Hayes didn't come to Oakwood High to draw attention. He drove his old Ford Mustang, the last keepsake of his late wife, 10 hours from North Carolina to this small Georgia town, just to see his son Jaden get his diploma. The uniform he wore wasn't for show. It was how he kept his promise to his wife, always be there for their son. Stepping into the packed Oakwood High auditorium, the air shifted. Curious stares, a few sidelong glances, and whispers brushed past. Marcus was used to it. A tall black man in a military uniform. He'd faced those looks his whole life. He settled into the fourth row, the family section, his hand grazing the wedding ring on a chain around his neck, feeling memories of Jaden and days gone by. But that quiet moment shattered when Darren and Cole, sporting sterling security badges, marched straight toward him. The auditorium started to turn. A mom nearby clutched her husband's hand, whispering, "What are they doing?" Marcus sat still, his gaze ice-cold, unmoving. He knew one wrong move could escalate everything. What he didn't expect was the 4 veterans, brothers who'd fought beside him in Iraq, quietly present in the crowd, and they were about to make those 2 guards regret picking the wrong man to mess with. The Oakwood High auditorium was bathed in pale yellow light from high-hanging bulbs, the air thick with cheap perfume and coffee. Metal chairs creaked, parents whispered, and a staticky speaker tested the mic, blending into a chaotic symphony of graduation day. Silver banners reading Class of 2025 shimmered across the old brick walls, where hundreds of students in black gowns lined up, laughing, some nervously adjusting their caps. But Marcus Hayes didn't belong to the bustle. He sat there, 4th row, family section, his eyes calm like a lake before a storm. His Marine uniform hugged his tall frame, not a wrinkle in sight, not to stand out, but because that's how he kept discipline, even when the world around him had changed. Marcus wasn't one to talk about himself. At 42, he'd seen enough of life's shadows to know words rarely changed anything. He grew up in a small town on the edge of Charlotte, North Carolina, where red dirt roads led to cotton fields and dreams never outgrew barbed wire fences. His father, a truck driver, once told him, "If you want respect, you gotta earn it." Those words stuck, through years of being seen as an outsider, through moments of being asked, "What are you doing here?" just for the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't let those looks define him. He joined the Marines at 18, not to prove anything to anyone, but to find a place where loyalty and work meant more than whispers behind his back. Iraq was where he learned what it meant to live and die. Dusty days in Fallujah, sleepless nights amid gunfire, and moments where one choice drew the line between survival and oblivion. There met Ethan Caldwell, Lucas Rivera, Noah Bennett, and Caleb Turner, for men fate bound to him through blood, sweat, and unspoken promises. Marcus wasn't the type to shout orders on the battlefield. He led by action, always the last to leave a post, the first to charge into danger. Once, during an ambush in 2004, he dragged Ethan from a burning Humvee, bullets whizzing past his ears. Ethan, blood streaking his face, managed to whisper, "I owe you my life." Marcus just shook his head. "Just keep breathing." That was Marcus. No need for thanks, no need for medals, just the knowledge that those beside him still had a pulse. 3 years ago, life tested him again. Clara, the wife he loved more than anything, was taken by cancer. She was his light, the one who laughed louder than anyone in the room, who always fixed Jaden's tie before school plays. When Clara passed, Marcus didn't cry in front of Jaden. He couldn't let his son see him break. But every night, after Jaden was asleep, he sat in the garage beside the old Ford Mustang, the car Clara used to drive all over town, and let the grief chew him up bit by bit. Her wedding ring, now hanging on a chain around his neck, was the only thing still tying him to those happy days. Jaden, now 18, was the living image of his mother. He had her bright eyes and a smile that made you pause to look a little longer. But Jaden also carried his father's resolve. He wasn't the star of the football team or the school band, but he had a big heart, always standing up for friends, always listening when someone needed it. Marcus was proud of Jaden, not for grades or trophies, but because he knew right from wrong, knew how to love, and knew how to keep a promise. Today, at Oakwood High, was Jaden's big moment, and Marcus had driven 10 hours through endless roads to be there. He didn't want Jaden to walk across that stage without seeing his dad in the crowd. When Marcus parked the Mustang in the school lot, the Georgia sun was scorching everything. He stepped out, straightened his uniform, and felt the weight of Clara's ring against his chest. The lot was packed with families, parents in freshly ironed shirts, kids holding congratulatory signs, an old lady with a cane standing by her grandson. Oakwood High looked like 100 other southern schools. Faded red brick, a few flags flapping lazily, and the faint sound of pomp and circumstance drifting from speakers. Marcus took a deep breath and walked with a soldier's posture, each step steady as if he were marching. He ignored the curious stares from a few parents nearby, tuned out the murmurs as he passed. His mind was on Jaden, on the moment he crossed the stage, and on Clara, who he knew was watching from somewhere. Inside the auditorium, Marcus found his seat, 4th row, right side, family section. He sat, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. Ahead, the stage was simple: a wooden podium, a few mics, and a big sign reading "Congratulations, Class of 2025. The students stood in rows at the far end, caps and gowns neat, some laughing loudly, others nervously biting their lips. Marcus scanned the crowd for Jaden. There he was, mid-row, lanky, black gown swaying, eyes bright like his mother's. Marcus gave a small smile, his first of the day. He touched the ring and whispered to himself, "You see him, Clara? He's all grown up." But that peace, that rare calm, didn't last. Marcus sensed the shift before it hit. Heavy footsteps, a crackling radio, and then the figures of Darren and Cole, the 2 guards, appeared in the aisle. They weren't just passing by. They were coming straight for him. Marcus didn't turn his head, but his eyes sharpened, like a soldier sensing danger before it took shape. He knew this moment wasn't just about a seat. It was about something deeper, older, something that had followed him his whole life. And when Darren spoke, with that curt tone and smirking grin, Marcus understood that today wouldn't just be Jaden's day. It would be the day this auditorium learned what loyalty looked like, what honor meant, and what strength came from a man who didn't need to stand to prove who he was. The laughter of students, the chatter of parents, the staticky speakers blaring the national anthem, all of it felt distant, drowned out by the steady pulse in Marcus's chest. He sat there, 4th row, family section, hands resting lightly on his thighs, eyes locked on the line of students where Jaden stood. Clara's wedding ring, hanging on its chain, brushed against his chest with each breath, like a reminder to stay calm. But when the 2 guards, Darren and Cole, stopped right beside him, their shadows stretching across the polished wood floor, Marcus knew calm was about to become a luxury. Darren, the lanky one, chewed his gum with an annoying smacking sound, leaning down just enough for his voice to carry clearly, but not loud enough for the whole auditorium to hear. "Look, buddy," he said, a hint of mockery in his tone. "This section's full. Move to the back, let's go." Marcus didn't budge. He slowly raised his head, eyes sharp as a blade, but his voice stayed low and even. "I've got a ticket. 4th row, right side. This is my seat." He pulled the ticket from his uniform pocket, holding out, fingers steady as if it weren't just a slip of paper, but a declaration. Cole, the stocky one with a flushed face and an attitude like he owned the place, stepped forward, blocking some of the light from the ceiling fixtures. "This area is for graduating students' families only," he said, his voice louder, like he was flexing authority. "You see how packed it is?" Marcus met Cole's eyes, unblinking. "I'm Jaden Hayes' father. He's over there, in the student line. This is my seat." The ticket stayed in his hand, but Darren barely glanced at it before looking away, like it wasn't worth his time. "We've got orders," Darren said, shrugging. "This section's full. There's seats in the back. Go on. Don't make this complicated." A few heads started to turn. A dad in the row ahead glanced back, frowning, then muttered something to his wife. An older woman with silver hair, sitting next to Marcus, gripped her purse tightly, her eyes darting from him to the guards, like she was holding back words. Marcus felt a shift in the air, the way the auditorium's attention was slowly zeroing in on him. But he didn't want a scene. He just wanted to sit here, watch Jaden cross the stage, and keep his promise to Clara. He took a breath, touched the ring lightly, and said, his voice lower but sharp as steel, "I drove 10 hours from North Carolina to see my son graduate. I'm not going anywhere." Darren let out a short, dry laugh, like Marcus had told a bad joke. 10 hours? Then you should know how to follow directions." He stepped closer, the radio on his hip crackling, and he touched it, like he was considering calling someone. Cole, right behind him, crossed his arms, eyes scanning the auditorium, as if making sure everyone saw he was in charge. "Listen," Cole said, his voice dropping, not to calm things down but to threaten. "We don't want a big deal. Just get up, go to the back, and everyone's happy. Simple." But nothing was simple in the way Marcus sat there, unmoving, like a statue forged from iron. He wasn't angry, not yet. He'd learned to leash his anger back in Iraq, where a second of losing control could cost his team their lives. But he felt something rising, not anger, but resolve, the kind he'd forged through years of being seen as an outsider, told to know his place. He looked at Darren and Cole and said, his voice slow, each word like a stone dropped into still water, "You want to make this a big deal, go ahead. But I'm staying right here for my son, and because I have every right to be here." Marcus's words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like a knife. Darren took half a step back, not out of fear, but because he hadn't expected a man to speak with such unnerving calm. Cole, though, wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, his voice louder, almost shouting, "You think that uniform means you can sit wherever you want? This is a school, not your barracks." The way Cole spat, that uniform, wasn't just about the seat. It was about something deeper, older, something Marcus had heard his whole life. At diners, in offices, on street corners. It was the insinuation that he didn't belong here, didn't belong anywhere people wanted him invisible. The auditorium was nearly silent around Marcus now. A mom in the back whispered to her daughter, "What are they doing to that man?" A student holding a phone tilted the screen, like they were recording. The silver-haired woman next to Marcus finally couldn't take it. She leaned forward, her voice shaky but firm. "Don't let them push you out, son. You've got every right to be here." Marcus gave a slight nod, not turning, but the nod was a silent thank you. He didn't want a scene, didn't want to turn Jaden's day into a fight. But when Cole's hand went to his hip, near the radio, and Darren stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could feel his breath, he knew things were about to spiral out of control. From the student line, Jaden, lanky in his black gown, stood among his friends, but his eyes weren't on the stage anymore. He'd noticed the guards since the anthem ended. At first, he thought they were just checking tickets, but when he saw his dad sitting there, stone still, with those two guys looming too close, his heart pounded harder. Jaden knew that look on his father's face, the same look he'd seen as a kid, when a drunk neighbor insulted his mom, and Marcus just stood there, silent, but made the guy back off. Jaden's fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to do something, but he knew his dad didn't want him stepping in. Not now. What neither Marcus nor Jaden knew was that in different corners of the auditorium, for sets of eyes were watching. Ethan Caldwell, graying at the temples, sat near the exit, arms crossed. Lucas Rivera, mid-bleachers, pretended to read the graduation program, but his eyes never left Marcus. Noah Bennett and Caleb Turner, scattered in distant rows, felt the air grow heavy. They didn't need to talk, didn't need a signal. These were the men who'd lived and died beside Marcus, who'd seen him run through gunfire to pull them from death. And now, as these two clueless guards thought they could force Marcus Hayes to move, they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. The air in the auditorium was like a taut wire, ready to snap. And that snap was closer than ever. The air in the Oakwood High auditorium was like an overinflated balloon, one prick away from bursting. Marcus Hayes sat there, fourth row, still as a rock in a river, his eyes locked on the two guards, Darren and Cole, but not with anger. It was something deeper, a chilling calm, forged through years, where a wrong blink could cost a squad their lives. Darren, his mouth working that gum nonstop, stood so close his shadow blocked the ceiling light across Marcus's face. Cole, hand still on his hip near the crackling radio, tapped his fingers like he was counting down to a choice he thought he controlled. But they didn't know, could never know, that Marcus Hayes wasn't the kind of man you forced, and they were about to learn that the hard way. "Listen," Darren said, his voice louder now, like he wanted the nearby rows to hear. "We've made it clear. You don't belong in this section. Get up, or I'm calling someone." He stressed someone like a threat, as if Marcus was a troublemaker who needed dragging out. Marcus didn't answer. He just stared at Darren, unblinking, and slowly set the ticket on his thigh, like it was the last proof he needed. "I've said it." Marcus's voice was low, each word like a hammer strike. "I'm Jaden Hayes' father. I have a ticket. I'm staying." Cole let out a short, scoffing laugh. "Jaden Hayes' father? Funny no one told us. Maybe check that ticket again, buddy." That word, buddy, the way Cole said it, wasn't just rude. It was an invisible jab, slicing into something Marcus had faced his whole life. The implication he didn't belong, that he had to prove his right to exist anywhere. The auditorium was nearly silent around them now. A dad in the front row stopped flipping through the graduation program, his eyes flicking over his shoulder like he didn't want to get involved, but couldn't look away. A young girl, holding her phone, tilted the screen, its blue glow flickering like she was recording it all. The silver-haired woman next to Marcus whispered, her voice trembling, "They've got no right. Don't move, son." Marcus didn't turn, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a wordless thank you. Darren, sensing the audience's eyes, seemed to double down. He leaned closer, so close Marcus could smell the mint gum on his breath. "You've got 10 seconds to get up," he said, his voice low but sharp, "or I'll make you regret messing this up." Cole behind him nodded, his hand now on the radio, like he was ready to call for backup. Marcus didn't move. He took a deep breath, touched Clara's ring lightly, and said, his voice slow as a river, "Do what you've got to do, but I'm not leaving this seat." Those words were a spark in a powder keg. Cole stepped forward, his boot nearly brushing Marcus's foot. "You testing us?" he growled, and this time, his voice was loud enough that a few people in the back stood curious. A teacher near the stage glanced over, frowning, but didn't step in. Jaden, from the student line, saw it all now. He stood among his friends, black gown swaying, hands clenched so tight his nails dug into his skin. He wanted to run over, to shout, but his father's eyes, that steel gaze, kept him rooted. Jaden knew his dad didn't need him playing hero. Not now. But just as Cole raised his hand, like he might grab Marcus's shoulder, a sound cut through. A chair creaked, not loud, but sharp, like a blade slicing the tension. Near the exit, a man stood. Ethan Caldwell, salt and pepper hair, black jacket hugging a solid frame, eyes like a bayonet. He said nothing, just crossed his arms, staring straight at Darren and Cole. No one noticed him at first, but then another chair scraped from the middle of the bleachers. Lucas Rivera, tall, dark-skinned, stood, eyes locked on the guards, hands in pockets but shoulders squared like he was at attention. Then Noah Bennett, in a far row, and Caleb Turner, near the stands, rose one by one. They weren't together, gave no signal, but the way they stood, The way they stared, it was like the auditorium belonged to them now. Darren stepped back half a pace, his eyes darting to Ethan, then Lucas, then Noah, then Caleb. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt it, an invisible pressure, like the air compressing before a storm. Cole, hand still near his radio, stammered. "Who are you guys? Sit down. This doesn't concern you." But Ethan took a single step into the aisle, and his voice rang out low, clear, like a bullet through the silence. "Why are you hassling this man?" It wasn't a question. It was a warning. The auditorium was nearly frozen now. A mom covered her mouth, whispering to her husband, "What's going on?" A student, phone still raised, panned slowly from Marcus to the four men. Jaden, from the student line, felt his heart race. He didn't know these men, but he sensed it. They weren't strangers. They knew his dad, knew him the way only those who'd faced death together could. Marcus didn't turn to look at Ethan, Lucas, Noah, or Caleb. He didn't need to. He knew they were there, like they always were, from the dusty days of Fallujah, when he pulled Ethan from a burning Humvee, when he ran through gunfire to keep Lucas alive, when he shielded Noah and Caleb in a night no one thought they'd see dawn. Ethan took another step, his eyes never leaving Darren. "I'll ask again," he said, voice lower, more dangerous. "What are you doing to this man?" Cole, for the first time, looked like he wanted to back off. He glanced at Darren, seeking support, but Darren was unraveling too. He touched his radio, muttering something, but his voice shook, lacking its earlier swagger. We're just doing our job," Darren said, his words feeble, like a leaf in the wind. The silver-haired woman next to Marcus stood, her legs trembling. "Your job," she snapped, voice high and angry. "You're humiliating a father on his son's graduation day." Her words rang out, and like a signal, others started speaking up. "Leave him alone," a dad in the back shouted. "He's got a ticket, can't you see?" A young girl added. The auditorium wasn't a passive crowd anymore. It was alive, humming with outrage and the recognition that something wrong was unfolding. But the four veterans didn't need the crowd's words. They stood there, silent, like living statues, their eyes saying more than any speech could. Marcus, still seated, touched the ring, and for the first time, he smiled. A small one, almost invisible. He knew these guards had already lost, not because he stood, but because of the men behind him, men whose loyalty never faded. But the story wasn't over. Darren and Cole, though on the ropes, hadn't backed off yet, and when Darren opened his mouth again, with words he'd regret for life, the whole auditorium would witness a moment no one, not even Jaden, could ever forget. The auditorium at Oakwood High was like a forest before a storm, silent but heavy, every breath waiting for lightning. Marcus Hayes sat there, fourth row, his gaze still razor-sharp, not once wavering before the two guards, Darren and Cole, who were losing their nerve. The four veterans, Ethan Caldwell, Lucas Rivera, Noah Bennett, and Caleb Turner, stood in different corners of the room, wordless, but their presence was an invisible wall, bearing down on Darren and Cole. The radio on Darren's hip crackled again, but he didn't answer. He knew calling for backup now would only make things worse, but he wouldn't back down. Not yet, and that was his biggest mistake. Darren took a breath, trying to regain control. He leaned in, so close his nose nearly brushed Marcus's ear, and hissed, each word like a knife. "You think that uniform makes you special? This is Georgia, not your battlefield. Get up, or I'll have you dragged out in front of this whole crowd." Those words weren't just a threat. They were a blow, an arrow aimed at Marcus's pride, his skin, the years he'd bled to protect the very country where a guard like Darren dared say he didn't belong. The auditorium held its breath. A mom in the back covered her mouth, eyes wide. A student, phone still raised, whispered to a friend, "What did he just say?" The silver-haired woman next to Marcus gripped her purse, lips tight, like she was ready to stand and yell in Darren's face. But Marcus didn't move. He sat there, hands resting lightly on his thighs, his gaze cutting through Darren like he wasn't worth a blink. He touched Clara's ring, feeling its weight against his chest, and for a moment, he saw her smile, heard her whisper, "Don't let them take your dignity, Marcus." He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was low, slow, but sharp as a blade. "You just crossed a line. Step back before this goes too far." The words weren't loud, but they rumbled through the auditorium like thunder, making Cole, behind Darren, take half a step back, his hand dropping from the radio. But Darren didn't know when to quit. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and turned to Cole, like he was looking for backup. "Hear this guy," he said louder, making sure the room heard. "Thinks he's some war hero. This is a school, old man. Nobody cares what you did." Those words were a bullet, not just at Marcus, but at everything he'd sacrificed: sleepless nights in Iraq, scars on his shoulder, times he pulled brothers from gunfire. The auditorium erupted in murmurs. A dad in the front row stood, shouting, "Leave him alone." A teacher near the stage stepped forward, but the principal signaled her to stop. The air was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. And that spark came, not from Marcus, not from the 4 veterans, but from Jaden Hayes. In the student line, Jaden stood among his friends, black gown swaying, hands clenched so tight his knuckles paled. He'd seen it all. His dad sitting there, unmoving, the guards pressing in, the 4 strangers rising like ghosts. But when Darren spat, "Nobody cares what you did," something in Jaden snapped. He didn't think. He didn't wait. He stepped out of line, ignoring the stunned look of the girl beside him, ignoring a teacher's call. "Jaden, get back." He marched to the stage, where a mic was still live, and before anyone could stop him, he grabbed it from a teacher's hand, his voice shaky but firm, booming through the speakers. "That's my dad. He's a Marine. He deserves to be there more than anyone in this room." The auditorium went dead silent. Every eye, from students to parents to the principal, locked on Jaden. He stood there lanky, graduation cap slightly crooked, but his eyes, those eyes were Marcus's, fierce, unyielding. Darren spun around, jaw dropping, like he couldn't believe an 18-year-old kid dared do this. Cole, for the first time, looked like he wanted to vanish. Ethan Caldwell, near the exit, gave a slight nod, a faint smirk, like he'd been waiting for this. Lucas, Noah, and Caleb stood still, but their eyes burned brighter, like small flames in the dark. Jaden didn't stop. He took a breath, his voice stronger through the mic. "My dad drove 10 hours to be here today. He fought for this country, and now you're saying he doesn't belong? You should be ashamed." The words were a punch, not just to Darren and Cole, but to the whole room. Scattered applause broke out, then swelled like a wave. A mom in the back stood, clapping. A student shouted, "Yeah." The silver-haired woman beside Marcus wiped a tear, whispering, "That boy's right." The principal, near the stage, went pale, motioning for an aide to run off, probably to call someone to defuse this. Darren, now red with anger and embarrassment, turned back to Marcus, like he could pin the blame. "This is your fault," he snarled. "You got the kid acting out." But before Marcus could answer, Ethan Caldwell stepped into the aisle, his voice slicing through like a blade. "That's enough. You've gone too far. Step back now." It wasn't a request. It was a command, carrying the weight of a man who'd given orders in life-or-death moments. Cole, hands shaking, stepped back, but Darren stayed put, his eyes flickering between Marcus, Jaden, and the 4 veterans. Jaden, still on stage, set the mic down, but his eyes never left his dad. He saw Marcus look back, and for the first time, he saw something in his father's eyes, not anger, not pain, but pride. Marcus gave a slight nod, just one, but it was enough to make Jaden feel like the whole world was behind him. The auditorium was an ocean now, applause still rising, but no one knew this moment was just the start. Darren and Cole, though cornered, hadn't backed off, and when the principal stepped forward, trying to calm things, another wrong move would push this to a climax the whole Georgia town would talk about forever. The Oakwood High auditorium shook with applause, like a wave rising and spreading, capturing every eye, every heart. Jaden Hayes stood on the stage, black gown slightly askew, graduation cap tilted, but his eyes blazed, locked on his father, Marcus Hayes, who sat there, fourth row, unmoving as a mountain. The four veterans, Ethan Caldwell, Lucas Rivera, Noah Bennett, and Caleb Turner, stood in their corners, their gazes fixed on Darren and Cole, the two guards now trapped in the snare they'd set. The applause wasn't just for Jaden. It was a declaration, an acknowledgement that what had happened, the injustice aimed at Marcus, couldn't be tolerated. Not today, not here. The principal, Ellen Whitaker, hurried onto the stage, face pale but trying to stay composed. She raised a hand, signaling Jaden to lower the mic, and spoke into the speakers, voice shaky. "Thank you, Jaden. Everyone, please, let's calm down. We'll continue the ceremony." But the auditorium didn't snap back to normal. The applause faded slowly, but eyes stayed glued to Marcus, to Jaden, and to the four men standing like specters, saying nothing yet making the room feel their weight. Darren, face flushed, muttered something to Cole, and the two, under the stare of hundreds, slunk down a side aisle, their shadows shrinking like cornered animals. Marcus touched Clara's ring on its chain, and for the first time that day, he exhaled a long, slow breath, like shedding an invisible burden. He didn't watch Darren or Cole leave. He didn't need to. He looked at Jaden, the boy he'd raised with wordless lessons, and saw in his eyes not just pride, but understanding, that doing right was never easy, but always worth it. Jaden, under his father's gaze, gave a slight nod, then walked back to the student line, gown swaying, like a young warrior passing his first test. The ceremony pressed on, but the air had changed. The speakers called each student's name, but every name now carried a new weight, as if the room shared a sacred secret. Students crossed the stage, took their diplomas, smiled at families, but many glanced at Marcus, like they wanted to say they'd seen, understood, and learned something. The silver-haired woman beside Marcus leaned over, whispering, "Your boy's incredible. So are you." Marcus smiled, a small, private one, and said, "Thank you, ma'am. He takes after his mom more." When Jaden Hayes' name was called, the auditorium held its breath for a second, then erupted. The applause wasn't just loud. It had rhythm, power, like a symphony of respect. Ethan Caldwell, near the exit, raised his hands, clapping hard, each beat like a hammer. Lucas Rivera in the bleachers followed, his eyes alight like fire. Noah Bennett and Caleb Turner, from their distant corners, clapped in unison, not for show, but as a tribute, not just to Jaden, but to Marcus, the man who'd led them through their darkest days. The whole room stood, unprompted, from parents to students to teachers. A dad in the back yelled, "Congrats, Jaden." A young girl, still filming, had tears glistening on her cheeks. Jaden crossed the stage, lanky, eyes bright like his mother, Clara. He took his diploma from Whitaker, shook her hand, but his gaze wasn't on the stage. It was on the fourth row, where Marcus sat, hand on the ring, his eyes shining with something only Jaden could read, pride, wordless, so deep it made the boy's chest ache. Jaden didn't wave, didn't grin wide. He just nodded, a small one, like saying to his dad, "I see you. I get it." Marcus nodded back, a mirror gesture, and in that moment, no words were needed between them. It was an invisible thread, tying two men, one who'd fought to bring him here, and one learning to carry those lessons into life. The applause lingered, longer than for any student before. Whitaker, on stage, quickly wiped her eyes, trying to stay professional, but even she felt something bigger unfolding. A teacher near the wings whispered to a colleague, "I've never seen anything like this." In the student line, the girl next to Jaden, braids tight, grabbed his hand, whispering, "Your dad's a legend, Jaden." He smiled, first time that day, and said, "You don't know the half of it." But that moment, beautiful as it was, wasn't just about Jaden or Marcus. It was about the whole auditorium, about those who'd witnessed an injustice and refused to stay silent. The silver-haired woman, the dad in the back, the girl filming, the students clapping till their hands stung. They were all part of it, part of a moment where loyalty, honor, and father-son love won. not with fists, but with silence and presence. The four veterans, after Jaden left the stage, slowly sat, but their eyes stayed sharp, like a reminder they were still here, ready if needed. Marcus settled back, spine straight, hands on his thighs, eyes on the stage, but his mind drifted to days gone by. He thought of Clara, how she'd have cried till her eyes were red seeing Jaden today, how she'd have hugged him so tight he'd pretend to grumble. He thought of Iraq, nights he thought he wouldn't come home, but stood firm for Ethan, Lucas, Noah, and Caleb. And he thought of his father's words, "If you want respect, you gotta earn it." Today, he hadn't just earned it for himself. He'd earned it for Jaden, for Clara, and for everyone ever told to move to the back. But the story wasn't over. As the ceremony rolled on, as other names were called, the auditorium carried a new energy, like it had been awakened by what went down. And somewhere in the exchanged glances, the hushed whispers, a bigger moment was brewing, one that would make this Georgia town talk about today forever, not just for Jaden Hayes, but for the father who sat there, unmoving, and the men who stood for him. The applause for Jaden Hayes still echoed in everyone's minds, even as the next students crossed the stage, took their diplomas, and grinned at their families. Marcus Hayes sat there, fourth row, his gaze fixed on the stage, but no longer the eyes of a soldier braced for danger. They were father's eyes, those of a man who'd seen his son stand up, not just for himself, but for what their family stood for. The four veterans, Ethan Caldwell, Lucas Rivera, Noah Bennett, and Caleb Turner, had sat down, but their presence lingered like mountain shadows, quiet yet unyielding. Darren and Cole, the two guards, had vanished down a side aisle, but the story of this day wasn't done. No, it was about to explode in a way this Georgia town would never forget. Principal Ellen Whitaker, on stage, tried to keep her composure, but her hand shook as she held the student list. She knew what had happened wasn't just a hiccup. It was a crack in the perfect picture of graduation day, and she couldn't let it end without fixing it. As the last student took their diploma, she stepped to the mic, took a deep breath, and spoke, her voice ringing through the speakers, clear but heavy with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and guests, before we close, I need to say something. Today, an unfortunate incident occurred, and on behalf of Oakwood High, I offer a heartfelt apology to Mr. Marcus Hayes." The auditorium went still, like the whole room was holding its breath. Every eye turned to Marcus, who sat there, unmoving, his hand lightly touching Clara's ring. Whitaker pressed on, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mr. Hayes, a Marine veteran, a devoted father, was treated with disrespect right here, in this auditorium. That was our mistake, and we'll review our procedures to ensure this never happens again." Her words were a stone dropped in a lake, sending ripples through the crowd. Scattered applause broke out, then grew stronger as parents, students, and teachers realized this wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement, a step toward justice. The silver-haired woman beside Marcus clapped first, tears glistening on her cheeks. A student in the back shouted, "Respect him." And the whole room, like it had been awakened, stood, clapping, not just for Marcus, but for everything he represented. Whitaker raised a hand, signaling for quiet, and said, "Mr. Hayes, we'd like to invite you to the stage so we can formally apologize." Every eye locked on Marcus. He stood slowly, his uniform crisp, his posture straight as a flagpole, but he didn't walk to the stage. He looked at Whitaker, then at the auditorium, and spoke, his voice low, resonant without a mic. "I didn't come here for attention. I came to see my son graduate, but I thank those who stood for what's right today." Those words, simple but powerful, shattered any doubt like a hammer. The auditorium erupted again, the applause louder, deeper, like the whole town was singing a hymn of respect. But the real shock was still coming. In the student section, a girl, Jaden's close friend Mia, stood quietly, phone in hand. As the room clapped, she posted a video online, the one she'd recorded from the start, capturing it all. Darren and Cole cornering Marcus, the four veterans rising, Jaden seizing the mic, to defend his dad. She captioned it, "This is my friend's dad, a hero. Hashtag honor the Marine." Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire across dry grass. Shares, comments, and hashtags flooded in, not just in town, but across Georgia, then beyond. A local reporter, at the ceremony by chance, snapped a photo of Marcus and sent it to her newsroom. By late afternoon, Marcus Hayes' story was trending online, with thousands calling him the unbreakable father. Marcus didn't know about the video, didn't know about the posts going viral. He sat back down, eyes returning to the stage, where students were now tossing their caps into the air, laughing and hugging. Jaden, from the student line, ran to his dad, no longer the boy Marcus once carried, but a young man with bright eyes and a strong heart. They didn't hug right away. They just stood there, looking at each other, and Jaden said, voice hoarse, "Dad, I'm sorry they did that to you." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder, his eyes softening, but his voice firm. "You don't need to apologize. You did what's right. That's all I ever taught you." After the ceremony, Marcus and Jaden walked to the parking lot, where the old Ford Mustang waited. The Georgia sun had mellowed, casting golden light over fences and other cars. Ethan, Lucas, Noah, and Caleb stood near the exit, saying nothing, just nodding to Marcus. He nodded back, a wordless language only those who'd faced death together could share. Jaden looked at them, then at his dad, and asked, "Who are they, Dad?" Marcus smiled, first time that day, and said, "They're my brothers, the ones who never leave you behind." In the car, Marcus slipped Clara's ring off its chain, placing it in Jaden's hand. "Your mom wanted you to have this," he said, voice low but warm. "Not to remember her, but to know you've got the strength to stand tall, even when the world tries to push you back." Jaden gripped the ring, eyes blurring, but he didn't cry. He just nodded and said, "I'll make you and Mom proud." Marcus started the car, the Mustang's engine roaring like a vow, and they drove off, leaving the auditorium, the stairs, and a story this town would tell forever. But what Marcus didn't expect was that Mia's video had done more than go viral. It sparked a small movement, with hashtag Honor the Marine becoming a symbol for those standing against injustice. Veterans across Georgia shared their stories, parents wrote about pride, and Jaden, unknowingly, inspired young people to speak out. Marcus, the quiet father, didn't need to know all that. He just needed to know Jaden had crossed that stage, that Clara had seen from somewhere, and that today, he'd kept his promise. Marcus Hayes' Ford Mustang rolled down Georgia's red dirt road, leaving Oakwood High and its stormy auditorium behind. Inside, Marcus and Jaden didn't talk much, but their silence wasn't empty. It was an invisible thread, tying two hearts, two generations, with pride and wordless lessons. Clara's wedding ring, now in Jaden's hand, glinted under the sunset, a reminder that strength doesn't come from shouting, but from standing firm when the world tries to push you back. Marcus, with a steady gaze, drove toward the future, but their story of loyalty, honor, and father-son love had carved itself into this town's heart and beyond, through the words spreading online. Life will keep testing you, as it tested Marcus Hayes. There'll be moments you're told to move to the back, that you don't belong. But as Marcus showed us, real strength isn't in yelling or throwing punches. It's in self-respect, in staying calm when injustice presses, and in trusting that the people who matter will have your back. Learn from Marcus. Hold your dignity, even when it's hard. Build bonds that last, like Marcus's brothers, who showed up without a word, and inspire through action, like Jaden, who stood for his dad, for what's right, and for himself. This story isn't just about a graduation. It's about how we choose to live, to stand, to love. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to know they're never alone. Hit subscribe for more stories of true strength, and drop a comment. Who would you stand up for when the moment comes?